Welcome to the Porch City Plate Podcast, presented by Bienville Bites Food Tour. The Porch City Plate Podcast is serving up the food, history, and people of Mobile, Alabama for people who love the Porch City. I'm your host, Chris Andrews, and on today's episode, we have Joycelyn Davis. Joycelyn is a member of the Clotilda Descendants Association, and she's also organized the Spirit of Our Ancestors Festival. And if you've paid any attention at all to the story of Africatown and the Clotilda, you'll know Joycelyn has pretty much been the face of the Clotilda Descendants. She's been featured prominently in the Netflix documentary Descendant. She's been a panelist on National Geographic, featured in 60 Minutes interview with Anderson Cooper. She just got back from London, where there was a screening of Descendant at the historic Ritzy Cinema there. So Joycelyn, welcome to the Porch City Plate Podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm excited. For a lot of our listeners, we have a few listeners outside the Mobile area. Maybe give us a 30,000 feet overview of Africatown, the Clotilda, and the entire story that you represent.
Wow, that's a lot. The Africatown, I like to say the Africatown / Clotilda story. The last known documented slave ship in U.S. history. That sinks into me because we're right here in Mobile, and that is so significant to the city that the last known documented slave ship is right here in Mobile, Alabama. I am a direct descendant of Oluwole, Charlie Lewis, and Maggie Lewis. And the history of Africatown and Clotilda in 1808 was slavery was abolished. It was illegal to bring in enslaved Africans to the United States. And there was a quote-unquote bet, you call it a bet or a for hire, that some local business owners made that they could go over to the Kingdom of Dahomey, which is present-day Benin, and bring in enslaved Africans without being caught. And one of those business owners was Timothy Mayer. It was Timothy Mayer and his business partner. So there were several individuals at this bet, because when I tell the story, when I talk about a bet, you just don't make a bet with you and your brothers. You make a bet with other individuals. So after making this bet, Timothy Mayer hired Captain Foster, who was the best sea captain. He was the best sea captain around, and the Clotilda was built in 1855, but it was built to bring in goods into the United States. It wasn't a slave ship. So after Timothy Mayer hired Captain Foster, Foster outfitted the Clotilda to bring in those enslaved Africans. And I like to be detailed in it. He outfitted the Clotilda, and he also hired a crew, because as a child, I just thought that one person went over to the Kingdom of Dahomey, but there was a process. He hired a crew, and they had to have all these different types of food for the crew and for the enslaved Africans. And then when I talk about the bet, he had to take $9,000 in gold, because there was an exchange between Captain Foster and King Glele. So it wasn't just him going over to get enslaved Africans. There was an exchange, and these individuals were already selected because King Glele had villages raided, and these individuals already in barracoons. And if you heard the book called Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston, that's what the word means, barracoon. It was a holding place. So this was 50 years after slavery was abolished that this happened. This was a 2-month journey, and the ages ranged from 2 to 25. These were babies, toddlers, high school age, college age students that were brought from the Kingdom of Dahomey to the United States, to Mobile, Alabama. And some were shipped to Selma. They were shipped to other parts of the states. Only 32 resided in Africatown, and of course they were divided here as well. Captain Foster received 8. Timothy Mayer and his brother received the bulk. My ancestor was enslaved by this person named Colonel Thomas Buford, which a lot of people don't know about, because I always like to bring out there were other individuals involved in that. But to make it short, is what these individuals did when they got here. After being enslaved for 5 years, they thought that once they saved their money that they could go back home, but they were denied. And you'll hear me reading a passage in Barracoon where Cudjoe Lewis goes and asks Timothy Mayer, can we go back home? And you'll just have to watch Descendant to hear the response at Timothy Mayer. They were denied. So they decided to make their own Africatown. And they started Africatown, and it includes Happy Hill, Kelly Hill, Lewis's Quarters. And they started a school, they started a church, they built their own homes. They had their own little Africatown after being denied that they could go back home. So it's a story of resilience, courage, and pride.
Absolutely. I think what I'm most fascinated by with the entire story is the fact that, as African Americans, you know exactly where your ancestors came from. And that's not the story of many African Americans in the United States. You know exactly, again, you know exactly what country your ancestors came from, how much how much was paid for them, the date they arrived, where they ended up. I think that's probably the most fascinating thing to me about this story. So what were, you said your ancestors were Charlie Lewis.
And Maggie Lewis, because I try not to forget about the women. We
right.
When most people are asked, they'll say the male and never the female. But we know that, just seeing your wife here with the children, like they bore the children, right?
Were they were not married prior to coming here, right?
No, they were not.
So tell us about your ancestors that were on board the Clotilda.
So my ancestor is Oluwale. Charlie Lewis was his enslaved name, and Maggie Lewis. Maggie is a name without a face. And when we talk about Mobile's history and some untold history, there was a young lady here in Mobile in the early 1900s. Her name was Emma Langdon Roach. And she wrote a book called Historic Sketches of the South. And the Roach family had a mortuary here in Mobile. And my ancestor actually worked for her as a grave digger. They had several jobs, but this is how she found those enslaved Africans, because in her book, she sketched them and she interviewed them. She actually interviewed 9 of those enslaved Africans. And my ancestor worked for her, and also his enslaver was Colonel Thomas Buford, which he had the Buford Plantation, which is what Gulf Lumber Company is, which is Can 4 now. And it's a secluded area. If you drive by, you wouldn't think that people live back there. Growing up, my mom would say, okay, we're going grocery shopping for Mama, which is my great-grandmother. We're going to the Quarters. And the Quarters was a place I went to all the time as a kid. This is my grandmother's mother's house. This is my mother's grandmother. All these generations of women. And I just thought it was the Quarters, but not knowing it was a slave quarters, right? It was just a quarter. We were just going to the Quarters. So my ancestor bought land from Colonel Thomas Buford in 1870. He and about 10 other enslaved Africans, and then some people that were already here, bought land from Colonel Thomas Buford in 1870, and that land still stays today. It's about 7 acres. And I am so proud that that land is still there. At one point, it was just Conception Street. All of my grandmother, her brother, and sister's mailbox was on the outside of the street. Now they have mailboxes where their house is, and also the sign is no longer Conception Street. It says Lewis's Quarters. But I'm hopeful that that area it needs to have a true historical marker, because it's been established since 1870. I know very little about Maggie Lewis, but I can, I always think about, well, she bore 5 children. She cultivated the land. She sold her goods to the markets. Although she's a name without a face, I know the things that she did. And Oluwale, Charlie Lewis, I read this in Dr. Sylvia Ann Duo's book, and also in Emma Langdon Roach's book, that Oluwale, if you given that name, that means chief. So he was a leader, And he was a leader in his village, and he brought those leadership skills here to the United States, because that's what gives me pride in him, because I had to grow into that, because I'm thinking, like, he bought land. And Maggie Lewis, her name is on the deed to that. So that's like women empowerment. It wasn't like, this is mine, it's not yours. It was a togetherness.
And I think that's interesting too, that you mentioned that he bought land in 1870, so that's only 6-7 years after they were set free. So yeah, he must have really done well for himself and been a leader to have been able to buy land in 1870. What's been the most fascinating story that you've found about Charlie or Maggie?
It's very few stories, but purchasing land, being a leader. Oh, there is something in Dr. Sylvie Ann's book and Dr. Natalie Robinson's book, is that if you got out of line, he would be the one to dish out the punishment. And in my readings, like they frown upon if anyone would drink, be alcoholics. Like, if you fell out of line, you would have to go and answer to him. So that's one thing, and thank you for asking me that. Yeah, that's one thing. But just so proud of what they did when they got here, when they arrived, and then they became U.S. citizens. They became registered voters. So during that time, when you think that I'm sure they were fearful for their lives, but they were able to persevere. And in the film Descendant, Dr. Kern Jackson says that they brought a different kind of flavor. And I heard that someone mentioned to me, said, well, they didn't come with a slavery mentality, and that's what Joe Womack says in the film. Like, the others were born into, and they had been here for so long, but they weren't, this was like their first 5 years here. So they didn't know anything differently. They just thought, they still had those leadership skills embedded in them.
That's interesting. What was your childhood like growing up in Africatown?
Oh gosh, I loved it because again, I had my great grandmother. She lived to be 97, so she was in my life until I was 21. And my great grandmother was in my life until I was 21. Right, my grandmother was in my life until I was 35. So I had these two women, rendering me, and of course my mom, but we lived within a mile of each other. So I didn't think that was different. I thought that was common, that you live that close to your grandparents and your great grandparents. Just now when I hear pecans falling off the tree, that sound is such a good memory. And I see people with buckets picking up pecans, and I'm like, oh man, I used to do that for Maria. We would, pick pecans for her. And growing up was great. You didn't have to leave the community for anything. If your car was broken, if your roof was leaking, you needed a plumber. Everybody in the community was skillful, that you didn't have to go outside the community for anything. If you needed your hair done, if you needed your hair cut, and if you needed a doctor, there was a doctor's office right down from my house. So everything was in the community growing up.
And that's changed a lot since then,
gosh.
Right? And I guess does the highway that come through there, does that have a lot to do with it?
Well,
it seems like they hit on that a lot in the documentary. The highway and coming through right through the neighborhood.
So that's not, and it's funny that it's not uncommon. The highways go through neighborhoods. I've heard that in Ohio and New Orleans that has happened with the highways, because that highway went smack dab through. And I remember when it happened, it was like 91, 92. And I remember a friend of mine, they had to move because of the highway coming through. But it took away. It took away. And I know that the powers that be thought that, this was, was going to be progressive, but it actually took away some things. And, the populations in our schools, the population in itself, because the housing project it was torn down, and just everything leaving just kind of it dampened the community a lot.
You mentioned in the Descendant documentary that growing up you were ashamed of being ancestors of slaves. What was a turning point for you for that? Like where did you go from being ashamed to being proud of your ancestry?
Reading more. I know you do this. Encourage your children to read more, do their research, study their genealogy, because a lot of those things have to come within for yourself. Someone can tell it to you, but you have to. It kind of grows in, because I'm like, wow. I never, as a teenager, I didn't think about the journey, and I didn't think about what they did when they got here. Not knowing about that was the last documented slave ship or any of those things, because I've said this to others that my friends were not talking about that. So I felt like if they weren't talking about it, then, I'm not going to say anything about it. So that was that shame. But, when you look back now, it's like, dear younger me, tell your story. Don't ever be ashamed. You have no reason to be ashamed. So it just took growth. And when you become older, you become wiser.
Yeah. How has the story become? It's become an international story at this point. And I guess you probably never could have imagined that would have been the case growing up. And it's happened all so quickly. How has this story become an international story in your mind?
Well, again, if your listeners will watch the film Descendant, when asked, I said that I don't want the momentum of the story to be about the ship. It's not about the ship. But it's become international because of the ship, but it's not about the ship. And I think that you have, these archaeologists, as Dr. Jim Delgado calls himself a ship nerd, and you have those type of people, it becomes international, which is okay. That's fine. Because we want that attention. But once we get people attention, we're going to tell them about the needs in the community. But it's international because of the ship and it being the last known documented. Well, I get that. That is the last known documented ship. And that the descendants still live in the community, and that we can directly trace our roots back to the ship. And only maybe 1% of African Americans can actually trace their roots back to their origin, back to the slave ship, the enslaved ship that they came on. So that's why it's international. And then you have internet, you have Instagram, and all these. So it's getting traction all over.
What is it that motivates you the most to tell this story? You say it's not about the ship, it's about the people, right, and about the community. Mm-hmm. And I think even in the documentary, I think you mentioned you never knew your life would be this exciting, and of course, like I mentioned, it's taken you to big cities around the world, and like what is it that keeps you motivated to tell the story?
Those who came before me, there was. There is the Clotilda Descendants Association, but before the Clotilda Descendants Association, there was another organization that started in the 80s, and those elders are still around. And I remember them bringing in delegates from Benin, holding events, holding festivals, telling a story for decades, and it didn't get far. And of course, that's during the time of no internet or anything like that. But for those, anyone who paved the way for you to be where you are today, it's because of them who paved the way, for the ancestors and for the elders that paved the way.
Mm-hmm. Another interesting thing, watching the documentary, I remember it showed you in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and the lady asked you, what are you going to do? And I think you've done that, right? You started a festival, the Spirit of Our Ancestor Festival. Tell us about that.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to talk about Mary Elliott as well. When everything was going on, National Geographic came in, the Smithsonian, so she held a seminar at our church. And that's how I met her. And she was talking about the importance of telling your story, holding on to different things, obituaries, photos, whatever, documenting things. So she was one of my inspirations, and she kind of pushed me. She pushed me and that pushed me into the first festival, which it'll be my 5th year in 2023. That's amazing to me. During that time, during that workshop that she did, workshop seminar at our church, that pushed me, because she challenged me right there in our little banquet room at our church, our fellowship hall. That's what we call it, our fellowship hall in our church.
What does that festival look like? What goes on during the festival?
So for the first 4 years, I wanted to educate people about the Africatown story, because although it is Alabama history, everyone doesn't know about it. So the first year we brought in Dr. Nellie Robertson, who wrote the books The Slave Ship Clotilda and The Makings of Africatown. The second year we brought in Dr. Deborah Plant, who is the editor of Barracoon. The third year we went virtual, yay COVID. Dr. Hannah Durkin from the UK, who has done research on Matilda Career and Rhodesia. And that event was called Women of Worth. So those first 3 years, I said, okay, I'm educating. We're having drumming. There's libations. There's fashion show. We've educated. So now how can we bring this story to life? So that was those 3 years. So the 4th year, I said, well, let's bring this story to life. So there was a guy here in Mobile. His name is Greg Cyprian. He introduced me to a guy named Terrence Spivey, who is a playwright in Ohio. I reached out to him, and I was like, hey, I would like to bring the story to life, and Greg Cyprian recommended you. So that happened, that birth, and the title of the play is An Ocean in My Bones. And it's great. The playwright is going to refine it. He's refining it now, and we're going to have it again 2023 at Mobile County Training School, where our ancestors founded Mobile County Training School in 1880. So, and that's to bring in the younger generation, because, we had the scholars to come in. So we're trying to reach out to the younger generation. And I want An Ocean in My Bones to grow just like To Kill a Mockingbird. I have a friend that lives in Monroeville, and he was like, Joycelyn, people flock to Monroeville for this story that's been told, the same story, for decades. I said, yes. I said, that's what I want.
And Mobile's a lot easier to get to than Monroeville.
Yes.
So yeah, people will go out of their way for that. I believe so. What do you think the future is going to look like in Africatown? Like, where do you see? There's a lot of talk about tourism and things like that. Where do you see that going?
I think that we're going to be blown away in the next 5 years. I don't want to wait 20, and that's just me being impatient. The Heritage House is one example, and the structure is there. I think they're going to I think that it will be opening in the spring, and that's where it's going to tell the story from the beginning, and there are going to be artifacts there. So that's one tangible thing right now that we can touch and we see that's in Africatown. And tours are going on right now. Eric Finley, Adora Finley, Franklin African American Tours, they do tours. And when you think that there's nothing to see right now, you'll be surprised when you take someone on a tour, and you can create until it happens, until the Welcome Center is built and new homes and art, because I would love to see Africatown resemble Africa with, mural, and there is a mural of the Clotilda, but more murals, more art, and a pavilion and things like that will come. But people will come to visit Union Missionary Baptist Church, the church I attend that our ancestors founded. The cemetery, you can do cemeteries tours, you can do the church tour, the Muriel, there's, Cleon, the home of Cleon Jones, and just different things. And Mobile County Training School is, one of the oldest schools in the state, and I I'm working with David Clark with Visit Mobile, and we've been training to be tour guides. And me not being a believer, I was like, well, how, what are we going to show them? But actually going through this workshop, it's like, well, Joycelyn, how long will your tours be? I was like, I can do a tour for 2 hours. Right? And you can, as Rosemary Judkins from the State Tourism Department, who has brought in Michelle Browder, she calls us experience givers. You can create that experience. So that's what I'm working on, and a few others in the Africatown community. So we're going to create our own tours.
I love that. Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to that. And like I said, yeah, it's an experience. It's storytelling. That I think about our Bienville Bites tours and Taste of Fairhope tour. It's not the facts and things like that captivate people. Mm-hmm. It's those stories and stories about people specifically. That's going to be the key.
Right.
There was a picture of you and President Obama and Michelle Obama at Martha's Vineyard. He came and did a surprise. I guess it was a surprise. He showed up there for the screening of Descendant at the African American Film Festival. And so there's a picture of y'all. Did you and him have a conversation? Did y'all talk?
Yeah, I still can't believe that happened, because I went to both inaugurations. I read The Audacity of Hope. I bought every Time magazine, everything. And we heard that the Obamas were interested in the film and Higher Ground. And we were invited to Martha's Vineyard for the film festival. And the Obamas, they live on Martha's Vineyard. But they didn't tell us due to security, because we would have been like, hey, I'm getting ready to meet Obama. So we didn't know. And, we're getting ready for lunch. And they're walking. And I'm like, oh my God, what do I say? I've been waiting on this, but I didn't think it was going to happen now. What do I say? Do I say Barack? Do I say Mr. Obama? Do I shake his hand or what? So, he came to us, he did his homework. He knew us. He knew Dr. Jackson was a professor. He knew Vita Tunsil was a nurse manager. He knew that I worked in the elementary school. So he did his spiel first. Right, and I went to shake his hand, and he was like, no handshake. He gave me a hug, and he told me that the last time he was in Mobile was during the BP oil spill. So, we had that conversation, and he was like, okay, let's have lunch. And Margaret was sitting next to him, and it was actually their birthday. They were a few days apart, but we had cake for their birthday. And Margaret wanted to switch seats with me, and I was like, no, Margaret, because she was I was like, no. She's like, I was like, not right. I was just still so nervous, and I was like, I'm sitting with the former president, and Questlove was there too, but I was like, okay, I'm looking, I'm like, oh man. So I'm left-handed, and I had this left-handed book. It's like Jimi Hendrix, Oprah Winfrey, Barack Obama, and all these people. And I was like, okay. I was like, Margaret, what hand is he eating with? I was like, I'm just going to go in for the left-handed thing. I don't know what else to talk about. And I was like, are you a true lefty? And he was like, yeah. I was like, I'm left-handed too. And he reached over and gave me a fist bump. So Margaret, and she's great, she was like, well, hey, just talk to Joycelyn about community and community leadership. And there's a photo of me engaged. So she scooped back, and we started talking about community work. And he was just telling me to stick with one goal, don't try to be all over the place, and just keep doing what I'm doing, and just encouraging me. So that was great. And then they said that, okay, so we're about to leave. And they said, well, we're not coming to the film festival because we've already seen it. So we get there, and they're introducing Margaret and Questlove, and then all of a sudden, they come out, Barack Obama, and then the crowd just went completely nuts. Standing ovation, just screams, because I think they like surprising people. I think they do. Mm-hmm.
That's really cool, and I think that now that you've got that connection, I think there's no better way to kick off your next event in Africatown with Barack Obama one day. So
one day we'll see. He may surprise us.
Yeah, that's right. You mentioned Questlove too. You and Questlove are cousins, right? So of the roots. Mm-hmm. Are y'all both descendants of Charlie? Okay,
we are, and He found out in 2017. And I can remember, this is another church story. I was at church, and a lady stopped me. She said, "Hey, Joycelyn, do you know Questlove?" And I was like, "Yeah." She said, "Well, he's a descendant," because she's also a descendant of Polly Allen. And I was like, she said, "Well, check it out and just see who he's related to." And I watched it, and he started calling out these names. And I was like, "Whoa, wait. That's my family. Like, we're related." And that was in 2017. You know, I started following him. I started tweeting. I started sending messages on Instagram. Every time he went live, I would go live and I could not, you know, I'm not saying it was a lost cause, but Margaret met him, and this was a few years later. Margaret was invited to speak on the discussion panel of Summer Soul, and that's when she met him. So she didn't meet him till like almost a year before the film was finished. So, you know, I was like, you know, when can we meet him? Everybody that I knew somebody that knew him. So I met him over Zoom because we were supposed to go to Utah for the film festival, but due to COVID, we didn't. Met him on Zoom. That was pretty cool. But my first time actually meeting him was at Martha's Vineyard. At one of the receptions. So met him then he came here for the screening in Mobile, and we were together in New York, and we were just together in London. So now me trying to reach out to him all those years, now I'm seeing him back to back to back.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
And y'all were just tell us about your trip to London. Y'all were just on a panel together, right? A Q&A session for a screening of The Descendant in London.
London, throughout my travels, London was really special. I met a lot of people from Nigeria in London. And I met someone that was like Mary Elliott that has her museum there in Brixton. We were talking about the Africatown story, and then she was telling me about, and this is another, I'm going into a history of this, that's why I'm pausing, and she was talking about Britain's involvement in the slave trade. So my mind was like blown. Not saying I didn't know. I was like, oh, wow. You know, because the stories that she was telling was like the Africatown story, being in Britain. And I was like, wow, I need to come back. And then she needs to come here, and we need to collaborate, you know, with Britain's history and the United States history, just to talk about the timeline. Because when I went there, she had this timeline, and it just went further back, of course, in 1800s. And I was like, wow, like, you know, and she would, because they sometimes in Britain, they don't know a lot about American history, because she never heard of the Clotilda. So now she's wanting to know more, and I'm wanting to know more. So London was special. London was really special. And the panel, and this, Chris, this is the funniest thing. The discussion panel was great. The Q&A blew my mind, because there was a lady in the audience from 8 Mile, Alabama.
Really?
I flipped out, but she left before I could meet her. She was like, "I just want to say hi." She was like, "My family's from 8 Mile." She's like, "I'm from 8 Mile." I was like, no.
That's crazy.
No, and we talked about, the people in the panel were talking about the Great Migration. And I was like, yeah, like my family, they would go to Chicago, and people were talking about, you know, from like people from Alabama all over. People are, you're going to find someone from Alabama, but I didn't think I was going to find someone from Alabama in London, but people from Alabama are all over.
That's funny.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to move on to our next segment of the show, and the next segment of the show is called Meat and Three. So we've already gotten into the meat of the podcast, so now I'm going to ask you 3 kind of rapid-fire questions. And first one is, what is your favorite food memory as a child?
My favorite food memory as a child, and I talk about picking up pecans, but another thing I used to do for my grandmother was pick blackberries. And I would pick them on the railroad track. And I didn't, like, today you couldn't tell me to do that, because I know what's in the bushes. I had no fear. I would just go and pick them because that's what she liked. But I would pick blackberries, and I would have bowls and bowls of blackberries. And she would make this blackberry cobbler. I would take it. I would clean them, and she would make this blackberry cobbler that was so good. And that's one of my great memories of she and me picking blackberries for her.
That's awesome. Mm-hmm. All right, the second question is going to be, all right, we've talked about you going to London and Martha's Vineyard, New York City, all over the world. What has been a memorable meal for you in all your travels?
In all my travels, the best food that I had was at the hotel at Park Lane. And it was really basic. I'm a Southern girl. I know that you can take me all over the world, but I always want to come back home for the taste of Mobile.
For a meat and three.
For meat and three. Because, Park Lane, the food was good there. Martha's Vineyard, it was okay. It was the experience of the town, but not the food. I would say that.
Okay. What's your favorite restaurant in Mobile right now?
Right now, my favorite restaurant is, I like Winstall's for the Oyster Rockefeller, which is my favorite.
Yeah, I love that. Mm-hmm. That's so good. Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to move on to the next segment of the show. It's called Chris's Dishes. And Chris's Dishes, I'll talk about the best dish that I've had in the last week. And the best dish that I've had in the last week was the Nashville Hot Chicken Pizza from Post on the Hill. Post on the Hill is a brand new restaurant in Spring Hill. Of course, they have their Post location in downtown Mobile. This is now their second location. It's inside the old August House. It's off Old Chill Road in Spring Hill. And I know a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with the 504 Post Toast that is on the Bienville Bites Tour sometimes. So you'll be familiar with that thin crust Post Toast. Well, this is the Nashville Hot Chicken, which had mozzarella cheese, spicy Alfredo, a house-made hot honey, and then top with pickles. It was so good. It had so much flavor and so much taste. Y'all got to get out there and check out the new space out there at Post on the Hill that's newly open. They've got a really cool, just a lot of room outside, and so I can foresee a lot of events happening there. It's going to be perfect for showers and things like that. So that was good stuff. What is the best dish that you've had recently in Mobile?
Gumbo from the Royal Scam. It's the best kept secret. I don't know why I call it a best kept secret, because some people, when they think about gumbo, they do not mention the Royal Scam. And when I mention gumbo, I would say, listen, you have to go to the Royal Scam for gumbo. It's like, you don't know. Like, the Royal Scam has the best gumbo.
Yep, I'm with you right there. Yep, I don't know if we've talked about it on this show. I talk about the Royal Scam gumbo a lot. I don't know if we've talked about it on this podcast before, so I'm glad you brought it up. Because I agree with you. That it is the best kept secret. It's so good.
It's so good.
I love that gumbo from Royal Scam. Joycelyn, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I've really enjoyed this episode. I talk about the Port City Plate podcast being about food, history, and people of Mobile, and we really nailed that today. We talk a little bit about food, and of course history, and then the people of Africatown. And I'm so thankful that you sat down with me today. I didn't plan on even saying this, but I don't know. I feel like led to tell you that it's interesting that my third great grandfather fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy, and your third great grandfather, grandfather were on board the Clotilda. Coming to the United States. It's really crazy that 160 years later. You and I are sitting here.
And that's okay. We can have that conversation. Yeah. And that's good to know that we can have that conversation.
Yeah, I love that. Maybe one more question. What can we do? What could people do that are listening to get involved? I think maybe there might be some hesitancy to for people like me that are busy and things like that. Maybe we don't know what to do. We want to support the efforts that y'all are doing in Africatown, but what would you recommend for our listeners? What could we do to get involved?
So if you want to get involved, and what the participant group is doing is they have a website called Descendant.com, and what Descendant.com is, you have Chess, MEJAC, the ARC, the Africatown Heritage Preservation Foundation, and the Clotilda Descendants Association. You have all those groups that are listed where you can donate to. So on Descendant.com, DescendantFilm.com, that's where you can donate.
Okay, very good. All right, so everybody, that's your homework for this episode, is you've got to get on Netflix and you've got to watch the Descendant documentary. You've absolutely got to read the book Barracoon, or better yet, listen to the book on audiobook, on Audible. That is where I think that's where the secret to that book is, because you get to hear the true African dialect of Cudjoe Lewis, and so yeah, I think you absolutely need to download the audio book of Barracoon and hear the story of the Clotilda, the story of Africatown. We've mentioned a lot of those books today on this episode too, and I've read many of those books as well. So they've all been good. You've been inspiring. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Thank y'all for listening to the Port City Plate podcast. You can check us out, portcityplate.com, and you can always book a food tour, bienvillebitesfoodtour.com, and subscribe anywhere to the Port City Plate podcast where you listen to podcasts, and we will check y'all out on the next episode.